In this message, we want to continue with the subject of the domestic life of the Messiah, the Honorable Louis Farrakhan, especially in light of the synagogue of Satan's imminent attack against his integrity and morality in its effort to turn the people against the Honorable Louis Farrakhan so they will yell, "Crucify him, crucify him." However, before going into this, we want to weigh in on the murder of George Floyd by 4 Minneapolis police officers in the protests and riots that have ensued, due in part to an intentional delay in real movement towards justice. The Minneapolis government perhaps assumed that the people would be satisfied with the firing of the 4 officers, which, by the way, establishes the fact that the Minneapolis government deemed all 4 of these officers to be involved in the murder of George Floyd. Well, these are obvious facts, which anyone with eyes can attest to. However, there are more subtle realities that are being or not being given due diligence. And among these is the inevitable collapse of government. What do we mean? Well, consider this from a recently published article. In fact, today it was published. It states, "The criminal activity that has rocked the streets of Minneapolis for 4 nights running could be partially the work of white supremacists," Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has suggested, citing his own suspicions. Walz shared his thoughts on the matter after a reporter asked him if he thought white supremacists were flooding into Minneapolis to cause destruction in the city. Now I'm going to pause here and say this, that even coming up as a notion means that someone is knowledgeable of Black people's behavior. And they know that the destruction being meted do not necessarily fit the behavior of Black people, because we by nature are not a destructive people. Now let's continue. He quotes, meaning Governor Walz, "I certainly can confirm personally on this. My suspicions from what I've seen on this, yes," he responded, noting that there were unconfirmed reports which corroborated his hunch. The governor also said he was receiving intelligence from federal agencies about various elements, including drug cartels, trying to take advantage of the chaos. Some commentators have been arguing that the protests and rioting in Minneapolis and across the United States have been at least partially or partly coordinated by Antifa and other far left groups. Now I want to make a few salient points on this reality. First, the United States government is notoriously known for destabilizing foreign governments by orchestrating social unrest and rebellions through the work of CIA operatives and surrogate military outfits. These treacherous schemes are currently being hatched today in many nations around the globe. So the Bible that is used to inaugurate elected officials, especially judges, it states, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Now, what I understand, you have certain people in President Trump's cabinet who are now campaigning against China on behalf of some other states or nations such as Taiwan and Hong Kong. Ain't that something? Now, what are you going to say about the social unrest taking place in your nation, since you want to condemn China for what's going on in Hong Kong and other places like Taiwan? Second, People of all races, gender, and ages are involved in the civil dissent taking place in the country. So if white supremacists are in the crowd, they don't appear to be harming black and brown people protesting alongside of them. It seems that the real white supremacists are on the other side and also on the wrong side of justice. Third, from what I understand of anti-fa, it stands for anti-fascist or anti-fascism, which is more an active movement against fascism than it is an actual organization that can be isolated and dismantled. So it's wise for the federal and state government, particularly those officials, including President Trump, to revisit the definition of fascism to determine if these governments, federal and state, have morphed into the very monster they pretend to be against. Because what you are is not what you say you are, but is what you do. And today, people are too intelligent, too frustrated, and too familiar with presidential and congressional lies, schemes, and wickedness to be fooled by fancy speeches of government tricksters and liars. Well, what is fascism? Since we have time, America has stood still, and we're not as busy as we used to be. Let's consider some of these terms that this government often says they are against. Communism, fascism. Let's see what this word means and then see if it applies to what's taking place in the borders of the United States, within the borders of the United States. Well, fascism is a form of far-right authoritarian ultranationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and of the economy. And this kind of government came to prominence in the early 20th century under certain dictators in Europe. Well, what is the social environment like today as it relates to fascism? Well, let's examine the regimentation of human behavior under the auspices of COVID-19. Wearing face masks can't even be permitted in certain markets without face masks. And then on top of that, standing 6 feet apart. Lines going down the grocery or arrows pointing you down aisles so you can walk in a certain direction as if I'm walking down the aisle and I don't have the courtesy to step aside and watch someone else come past me who's also wearing a mask. How about not being able to visit loved ones in the hospital who have to die alone, or your grandparents or parents in a nursing home? How about not being permitted to gather into large groups? And if police see that, then they are compelled or authorized to break that crowd up. We're talking about regimentation and fascism. How about churches now reopening, but also under certain conditions, such as you can open your church, but you can't have a choir because we're afraid that the singing may bring out the COVID virus. You can't pass the plate because you may pick up the virus from somebody's hands as the plate is passed. And you got to be 6 feet apart in the church, which means that it's going to be a lot of space and not many people can go in there. Who the hell would want to open up their churches under those kinds of conditions? Fascism. And there's a litany of other regimented behaviors under the auspices of a dubious pandemic. Not saying that the virus ain't real, but your levels now are coming down. The projections, the models that was used to justify a pandemic, now all of a sudden there's a switch up. Well, it's not as many deaths estimated as we thought it was. But look what you did. And look what you're doing. Fascism. Now let's also examine, in light of fascism, the so-called executive orders of President Trump being meted against private companies. So you have the authority to push an executive order of everything you don't approve of, like you can be censored. How about President Trump's tyrannical language as a president, such as shooting citizens for looting property, not for killing somebody else, but I'll shoot you if you break that window. Fascism. It might be racism. That's part of the whole gamut of fascism. So these realities in the United States are the clearest sign that Antifa is not off base in what is perceiving that this country has morphed into on state and federal levels. So President Trump, as well as those in his cabinet and state governors, are extremely blind in believing that the entire National Guard or armed services can resist millions of U.S. citizens, both armed and unarmed, who are moving toward a breaking point of complete intolerance with egregious corruption of their federal and state governments. You are blind if you think calling in the National Guard, a few thousand people, can squash legitimate social unrest because of your fascist, silly behavior. Well, I'm going to tell you, history shows that don't bode well. You have examples right in front of your eyes, and then you have the example of God's chastisement of wicked governments and wicked leadership. So you're about to get hit with a furious combo, one from God and one from the people who are tired of corruption that's only been squeezing them ever more. So this is only the beginning of unending civil dissent, because federal and state government tyranny is precisely the reality in the United States. I know it, the people know it, and them damn demons in government know it. So when President Trump pursues the global war of desolation, which he's now doing, trying to make a case against China and Russia so he can get the American people to buy in to a war that is for the benefit of his few homies in the synagogue of Satan. When you start marching closer to that war, you will meet great public dissent. So it's only the beginning. And this nation will plunge into near complete anarchy because of these blind demons.